Okay, thank you, Vicki. And I think it's kind of fitting that I follow Gord talking about MRLs, because about 80% of what I'm going to be talking about is unregistered, and there's no MRLs for yet, so keep that in mind. Just a bit of background of why we're doing the work that we're doing. As you know, pulse crops have limited weed control options. We're highly reliant on Group 2 herbicides like Solo and Odyssey, and so we're trying to find and introduce some different modes of action into pulses. And even though our focus is broadleaf weeds, we also are concerned about resistant grass weeds, Group 1 and Group 2 resistance. So we'd like to see if there was an opportunity to introduce another mode of action into the pulse phase of a rotation in order to manage resistant wild oat as well. So the objectives of our project was to develop strategies to manage herbicide-resistant weeds through screening herbicides with alternative modes of action, looking at tank mixes or sequential applications, and developing Group 14 resistance in lentil and identifying if there's cross-resistance. We're really looking at sulfentrazone. I'll talk about or give you details on that later. So our target weeds, there's three main target weeds in terms of broadleaf weeds. The first one being Group 2 resistant kochia, Group 2 resistant wild mustard. Both of these are particularly problematic in lentils. In the northern part of the province, Group 2 resistant cleavers is a focus of our research, particularly in peas, and as I mentioned, either Group 1 or Group 2, and in some cases we have multiple resistant wild oats and looking for some strategies to control that. So our search for alternative modes of action, one group that we're focusing on is Group 14, and 5 years ago we had very few of these herbicides. We were able to introduce Authority or sulfentrazone a couple of years ago, get it registered. Been working on that for 10 years. BASF, of course, introduced HEAT, FMC with Clean Start. So this group is still kind of underutilized in Western Canada, and we're looking at some different herbicides that we'll talk about in a minute. The other one that's very rarely used in Western Canada right now are called Group 15s, and we're evaluating an experimental compound called peroxysulfone. The symptoms that these types of herbicides produce are similar to what you get with ethylfluralin and trifluralin, Edge and Treflan. They're seedling inhibitors, so they're soil applied and require water for activation. So our focus with peroxysulfone right now is primarily wild oat. I also want to talk about a couple failures. I mean, I'm sure you wonder why I'm going to bring this up, but the point I want to make is that we screen a lot of herbicides, and we have, or as many as we can find. There's not a lot of herbicides out there, and so they're not always successful. And one herbicide we looked at was Linuron, which is a Group 7. It's not a new herbicide. It's been around for a long time. It's registered in the United States in lentils pre-emergence for control of prickly lettuce. We thought maybe it might work for wild mustard, but we found that the rate was just too high that we had to apply. The crop tolerance wasn't sufficient, and it was just a little too risky. Also, this has undergone a re-review from PMRA, and it may end up being deregistered. So we decided to not go any further with it. The other one is a product from Arista that's not registered in Canada, was Propizachlor. It was a pre-seed application as well, required lots of moisture for activation. We were looking at it for cleavers control. And again, the application rates were way too high in this day of reduced risk herbicides and inconsistent weed control. We couldn't even get good weed control in 2010 when our rainfall was well above normal. So those are two that we've dropped. In terms of herbicides that we're doing more work on, Authority or sulfentrazone, as I mentioned, it's now registered in field pea, chickpea, flax, and sunflower, and you're well aware that lentils are sensitive. It's a very effective herbicide on kochia, wild buckwheat, lamb's quarters, and red root pigweed, probably the best kochia killer I've ever worked with. When we were doing our work on these other weeds, we did notice that it had some activity on cleavers, so that's what we're focusing right now. And the other aspect of it is, are we able to identify some lines or develop some lines of lentils that have higher levels of tolerance to sulfentrazone? So that's the other part of the research. So if you just look at some of the work we've done on cleavers control, if you look at the efficacy of a few studies on soils where we have less than 3.5% organic matter, that low rate, that 105 gram rate is the low rate, 140 the high rate. And on low organic matter soils, we're getting very good control at both rates. When we go to 3.5 to 5% organic matter, we need to go to that higher rate. I mean, we're getting reasonably good suppression at the low rate, but control at the high rate. And the 2x rate is just in there from a crop tolerance point of view. The only limitation is that we still haven't really come up with a rate, or we find that if you have soils with higher than 6% organic matter, the results have been quite variable, and we're going to have to refine rates. So, most of the cleaver problems are in the black soil zone, where the soils tend to be higher than 6%. If you're in the gray soil zone, we've done work up in choice land, and it's worked very well on soils because those organic matters aren't that high. So it will be an option for pea growers for controlling cleavers on some soils. As I mentioned, lentils are sensitive, but Bert Vandenberg felt that if other pulse crops had tolerance, there's got to be somewhere. There's got to be a gene in the lentil germplasm somewhere that has tolerance to sulfentrazone, and we've done a lot of screening. And so the bottom line really is that there is quite a bit of variation in tolerance to sulfentrazone within the germplasm. You can see the top there, that's a very or moderately tolerant to tolerant lentil to a very susceptible lentil. So the other thing we're finding is that these particular lines not only are tolerant to or have a higher level of tolerance to sulfentrazone, but they have a higher level of tolerance to other group 14 herbicides like heat. And so this is just a study to validate that, looking at heat. And the idea behind that is if you could apply a higher level of heat, a higher rate of heat, you could possibly get some residual control of weeds like wild mustard. So if you look here, this is the susceptible on my left and the moderately tolerant on the right. Of course, those are checks. At the 2x rate of heat, you're starting to see injury on the susceptible. The moderately tolerant actually showing very little injury. 50 grams, we're starting to see injury on the moderately tolerant, but still not as bad as the susceptible. And at a very high rate, the highest rate that's registered in peas, for example, or chickpeas, you can see that the susceptible are pretty well wiped out, but the moderately tolerant still have some tolerance. So we will continue to do some screening, and hopefully in the future we can at least have a line where we could shorten that 36-month recropping restriction, and who knows, maybe in the future some lines where you can actually apply sulfentrazone. So I'm going to have to speed up here, I'm sorry, but there's a lot to cover. The next thing I want to talk about is flumioxazin. It's another group 14 that's soil applied, similar to sulfentrazone in its use pattern. It's actually going to be registered in peas shortly under the trade name Pulse Plus from Syngenta, and we are investigating the tolerance and efficacy in lentils. We find that this is a study at Rosetown. We found that the spring application was more risky than fall, so we'll focus on fall in the future. In terms of the best weed control results we got were at Scott this past year. Kochia controlled, the rate range is in that 71 to 107 gram rate. We're getting some suppression of Kochia, not quite wet enough maybe, and perhaps because lentils aren't as competitive, we may need to go to a higher rate. But we also got pretty good suppression of wild mustard within that rate range, which we don't typically see with sulfentrazone. And just to give you a bit of an idea of visually of the type of weed control, there's the untreated check full of lamb's quarters, wild mustard, and kochia. That's the 107 gram rate, so the high rate in the proposed rate range for peas. Still got a bit of wild mustard in there, but you can at least see lentils, and you know, at a slightly higher rate. Not perfect, but not bad either. Another product we're looking at is unregistered in Canada. It's a post-emergence group 14 herbicide called fluthiazide methyl. It's registered in corn and soybean in the United States. The trade name is Cadet, and we're looking at it as a possible tank mix partner with group 2 or other broadleaf herbicides. It does cause some leaf burn, but for those of you who have used Sencor over the years, you are kind of used to this. And we are going to look at ways of reducing the amount of injury through different adjuvants or adjusting the rate of adjuvant. Low use rate patterns, 2 to 4 grams or 2 to 8 grams we've tested. Even at 4 grams, you're seeing over 90% control of kochia. When we tank mix it with Sencor, we had 2 gram rates, and we were getting well over 90% control of kochia with the 2, so there seemed to be a little bit of additivity. Wild mustard by itself, it provides some suppression. It didn't improve wild mustard control when we tank mixed it with Sencor. The Sencor worked very well by itself. The last herbicide I want to talk about is peroxasulfone. Again, an experimental compound. It's a corn herbicide in the United States, which is registered or will be registered soon. A group 15 herbicide, soil applied. It requires moisture for activation. It's got activity on a number of weed species, but as I mentioned, we're focusing on wild oat right now, although we know there's some activity on cleavers. We have had some variable results because of moisture requirements. If you look in 2010, okay, can I back this up? Yeah. In 2010, our efficacy was very good at all rates that we tested, so well over 90% control. Now we had, of course, remember 2010 was a very wet year, so we had at least 3 times our normal growing season precipitation. When we tested it again in 2011, the results weren't as good. We had to go to the highest rate to just get some suppression. And the main difference there, of course, was the amount of rainfall, particularly after application. So 2010, of course, as I mentioned, 3 times the normal growing season precipitation. 2011, although it shows that it was normal precipitation, we had about 6 weeks after the time of application in the spring where we didn't get any appreciable precipitation, and I think that affected the results. So we are doing more work to try to improve the consistency of the product. We're looking at fall application with the idea that the snow melt will wash it in. However, in order for that to work, we're going to have to get snow, so which we haven't had this year. But we are looking at ways to try to improve its consistency. So to summarize, I went through things very quickly. I want to mention that in the Pulse Point magazine, I've done an article on this, and so there's more details in the Pulse Point magazine that you should be getting if you want to read it over. As I mentioned, the results are very preliminary, but I think we're making some real good progress here, and we wouldn't be able to make this progress without the support of the Pulse Cluster and the Sask Pulse growers. So our best case scenario, we will deliver recommendations for cleavers control with sulfentrazone. We hope to be able to identify group 14 tolerant lentil lines, have data for further minor use registrations with flumioxazin, and data for registrations of fluthiazide methyl and peroxasulfone. So I'll finish by acknowledging the Pulse Science Cluster and the support of the Saskatchewan Pulse growers who have given strategic funding to the University of Saskatchewan to do further work in weed control, and also the support of both the Pulse Growers Association in Alberta and Manitoba. Thank you.